Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today on the NBS Journey to BIM webinar. My name is James Tappenden, and I'm the marketing coordinator here at NBS. I'm joined here by my colleagues here at NBS and also Ideal Standard, but I'll be introducing them in just a moment. First, I'd like to just cover off some webinar functionality so everyone's familiar with that software. All attendees will be muted through the webinar just to avoid any unwanted background noise, as you could imagine. As mentioned on the first slide, as you can see just there, we have a questions functionality within the webinar software. So on the right of your screen, you'll see that. We encourage you to ask any questions during the webinar. We'll try to answer these as we go along, but we do have a dedicated Q&A session at the end, and we'll likely just leave it till that section. So the speakers on today's webinar will be Chris Vickers, Senior BIM Author here at NBS, Jane Hibbert, also Senior BIM Author here at NBS, and we also have Lee Jones, who's the European BIM Manager at Ideal Standard. I'd like to pass you over now to our first speaker, Chris Vickers, and he will take you through the first stage of the webinar.
Afternoon, everybody. So really, the sort of first section is really a more sort of overview of BIM and the sort of process. We'll also look at a section on the BIM object standard. And we'll also look at the sort of different products and offerings that NBS do offer the construction industry as a whole. So this first slide here is all about, or certainly this is a definition coined by NBS back in 2016. Really think about what is BIM, and I think it's quite important that as an industry we don't lose focus of what we're trying to achieve. I'll not read that slide word by word, but we need to ensure that we don't think of as BIM as just a 3D CAD environment. There is much more. There is much more of an output from the whole process. So if I just click some keywords, or pick some keywords from this description, you'll see in there that there's information, process, collaborative working, whole life value. So what BIM to us as a business, it's all about process and people, and the idea that we need to maintain assets, or commonly referred to as sort of manufacturers' products. So what do we mean? What do we need to maintain from sort of concept stage up to sort of construction and handover? And it's all about getting the most value out of the information that's contained within the model itself. So information is key to everything we do. Here at NBS as a business, we are very much a digital construction business. So manufacturer's data is key to everything we do. So we do actually hold a substantial amount of data. So we use that information on the NBS BIM Object Library. We also have Reba Product Selector, so where we host sort of product data sheets, certificates, etc. We also have NBS Plus. So NBS Plus is the manufacturer's content that sits within our specification software. We have the NBS BIM Toolkit. So this toolkit was delivered on behalf of the government. So this is a process of delivering projects through the Reba workstation stages, and it sort of documents what information is required at a certain stage in the process. But we're quite unique in what we offer. Everything, because we sort of use a central source of information, all our products are interlinked. And a good example of that is on the NBS National BIM Library and the Revit plugin. We can actually begin to sort of link the model itself back to specification through the Revit plugin. So there's opportunities here just to sort of align different processes in construction and the sort of design process. So everything we do on the BIM library is very much focused towards the BIM object standards. So this is the latest version, it's version 2, which has been published back in April, I think it was. So this is a free resource to download. It is a very good read on a night time before you go to bed. So this has been developed in recognition that our customers are now very much on a global scale. So we needed to adapt the original standard to just accommodate these sort of regional changes and things like classification. Do they or don't they need COBE information as a sort of deliverable? And I'll touch upon those sort of areas as we go through this section. So really, these are the 5 main sections in the document itself, and I'll give a brief overview of what each of these means. So the first sort of section is really trying to ensure that when we create content, it's ensuring that the software itself recognizes what it actually is. So if we create a door, we need to ensure that Revit understands it's a door. And the reason we do that is if you then export the model itself to a different format, such as IFC, and then bring it into another sort of software package, even though you've took it out of its sort of native environment into another platform, we need the model itself to still recognize that a door is a door and a window is a window, just to allow sort of filtering of the model itself to schedule correctly. So they're really the sort of key considerations in the general section. But as we go through the different sections in the document itself, it becomes a little bit more technical. It's probably worth noting as well that this document itself isn't a new standard. NBS haven't just gone away and tried to sort of influence how we create content or how we expect the construction industry to deliver information models. It's really a collation of existing standards brought together in a sort of more readable format. So the information requirements are quite extensive. So when we structure information on the library itself, we actually do pull information from various sources. So the property groups noted there are somewhat dictated to us by organisations such as Building Smart that you might have heard of. So IFC actually provide us with certain property sets according to product types. We also include COBE information, so that's to do with sort of facilities management, things like warranty information, etc. We have a section on general, which is how we name an object, classification information. It's this section in this section that we can sort of tie back the object itself to our specification software. We capture certification information, so BBA certificates would sit under this section. We also collect any environmental, apologies for the typo on that, environmental certification. And then the last section there, NBS data, is essentially all the keywords from our specification software. So what we're trying to establish on the structured data side of things is we try to align all our different products with the library itself. So this means when you sort of link back your objects to specification, there is a nice sort of correlation between the two. But because we use a lot of information from various sources, we need to consider sort of property selection and order. So we do find there's quite a bit of overlap from these different sources. We just need a sort of rationale of how we sort of group things together. Our speaker from Ideal Standard, Lee, will elaborate a little bit of how they sort of tackled this area in more detail later on in the presentation. On the geometry side of things, we're very much of the view that less is most definitely more. We do see a lot of content that has been developed where they've gone to the nth degree and indicate things like threads on screws. From a sort of designer's perspective, that isn't really relevant to them. They're more concerned with the sort of coordination element. And very much so that content needs to be usable. So the bigger the file size, the more clunky it is to maybe change certain aspects of geometry. So things like parametric control. If it is a large file and you try to change the size, it will sort of impact performance. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And one of the ways around that is to introduce what we call symbolic data. So sort of 2D line work, so you don't need to create everything in 3D. You can overlay 2D symbology, and there is a British standard out there which looks at this sort of area. So if you're not familiar with any of the British standards, 8541 is a good one to start with, and it'll give you a good understanding of how to approach that. From a functional aspect, we also need to consider what it is an end user might want to do with the content that we create. So it's sometimes quite difficult to do a capture all at library level. So we need to build in sort of certain functionalities to allow the end user just to manipulate a sort of default setting within an object. So a door is a good example where it could come in sort of 6 standard sizes, but an end user may actually want a bespoke size. So we just need to build in that sort of functionality. Things like connections, does pipe work for a boiler, for example, need to be connected in a model? It most definitely would do, so we just need to build in that functionality. We also need to consider things like space requirements, so access zones are really good to include. And then finally, we need to think about how we name objects. I think it's just human nature that even across an office, somebody will definitely call something completely different from somebody else. So we just need to be consistent in how we name BIM objects, the materials, the files themselves. File naming is quite important, and it does help if you do save objects onto your sort of server. As a designer, you can, if the structure is correctly and the fields are populated as they should be, it's then really easy just to filter down and find what you're looking for. So the final section for me is really to think about BIM object suitability. So not everything would need to be created as a 3D object. And I've got a few examples here on the screen. Some of these to do with the software limitations themselves, and other examples are just products that you just wouldn't attempt to try and sort of model to this level. So if you think about the thousands of meters or even miles worth of cables that were or could be within a building itself, you wouldn't expect a designer to model each sort of cable run. The software itself is quite intelligent, and you can do that in a more transparent and easier way than having to model to that nth degree. So cables is a good example. This example here is plasterboard reinforcement tape. Again, for a designer, what they're concerned with on a plasterboard partition is they want to ensure that the room is the correct size. They want to know that the sort of acoustic rating is correct, the fire rate is correct. They're not really concerned with is some reinforcement tape across 2 boards. Does it bridge the sort of wall and ceiling transition? And then there's finally this last example is an Ancon 3D wall tie. So Ancon are on the library. So I'll probably just give it away that these are suitable. But if you think how we still construct in the industry, we still very much rely on 2D information. So in this example here, you can see that you've got some masonry work there on plan. You can see that we've indicated wall ties, because wall ties are still an integral part, and they do provide a sort of structural element to the building. So even though in a 3D environment we wouldn't expect designers to place thousands of wall ties in a 3D environment, they are very much applicable and relevant to a 2D object. So there are sort of varying criteria to what is suitable and what isn't, and certainly NBS can obviously support you guys on that aspect. So really that's what I wanted to cover today, just to really give you a sort of introduction to NBS and what we do in the library. I will hand you over to my colleague Jane Hibbert, who will talk you through the National BIM Library process in more detail.
Yep, so hello everybody, my name's Jane and I'm a senior BIM author. If you did sign a contract with the NBS National BIM Library, I would generally be the person who held your hand on the phone through the process and developed the BIM objects with yourself. To start with, I just thought I would go through the two types of contracts that we have. If you don't have BIM objects, we have an authoring contract. Here we collect your 2D CAD and your technical data sheets and transform that information into a BIM object with all that technical information attached, which Chris has took you through earlier. There is steps throughout the process where we liaise with you to approve the information. So we do that whole process for you. There is a certification contract. We understand that we can't create all of the BIM objects in the entire world, and there's lots of you on this WebEx who already have BIM objects. What certification contract is we take your BIM objects as you already have them, we review them with regards to the NBS BIM object standard, and kind of work with you to get them in line with the NBS BIM object standard and then host them on the library. So I'm just going to take you through a typical authoring process first, where we create the objects for you. So I generally suggest it's a 5-step process. First step is a welcome call. Here we review all the information that you send across to us. It's imperative that we have 2D CAD to create a lot of content. Just take you through how long it'll take to get BIM objects. We try and deliver content within 12 weeks. At the moment, we're delivering kind of BIM contracts within 8. If you have any priority products that you need for a project, this is the time to kind of discuss that and let me know when you need them for. And it's just to make you very aware that there is a part that you kind of play in the process, which I'll take you through next. Step 2 is structuring your web pages. So we work with you to get an image of all your products that's on your contract, a nice product description, and then take you through including all the, make sure that the description includes all the buzzwords and kind of how people would search for your product on the website to make it easy to find for the designers. So that's step 2. Step 3, we take your technical data sheets and structure the information, which will then be embedded inside the BIM objects. This information is structured with regards to the NBS BIM object standard, what Chris just took you through. Here we start and define the product information, bring in a classification, start and bring some continuity from the specification and in the BIM object. And this is also when you'll probably hear the phrase BIM level 2 thrown about quite a bit when you're thinking about BIM. Here we build the information in to help designers deliver BIM level 2 projects. This information is structured by NBS, but is then sent out to you to review and get sign-off for. We generally have a WebEx to take you through this information, just to make sure that you're happy with everything that we've included. The next stage is the 3D geometry. So we take your 2D drawings and convert them into a 3D world. So it's not just the kind of general look of things we need to take into consideration. If we are building a product that requires functionality, we need to build that into the object and still make it quite easy for the designers to use. So when we're creating the 3D side of BIM objects, there's lots of functionality behind the scenes that we need to build in there. This cubicle, for instance, the accessible cubicle on the side can just be added with a tick box. For us to do that, there's lots of kind of formulas and mathematics we do behind the scenes for this this object to work in the simulation like it does in real life. That's an authoring contract. For a hosted contract, we take your BIM objects that you already have. You already have the 3D geometry for them. We generally review them with regards to the BIM object standard and the geometry section, just to ensure that they work in the BIM platform like they should, and fit for purpose for the designers. I think the thing that a lot of people struggle with was the technical data and the structuring of that information. We do that for you, and again, we work together with you to create the web pages to promote your product on the website. So again, we'll work with you to collate the images for your products and the descriptions and how you want them named on the website, and make sure all your kind of buzzwords with regards to SEO are all included in there. So when designers are searching the website, they can find your product with ease. So what I'm taking you through now is the toolbar for Autodesk Revit that NBS have created. The first section that I'm showing is a mini version of the website within Revit. I think so. Historically, when people are downloading objects from the National BIM Library website, they take them from the website and download them onto their computer, add them into Revit, and add them to their project. This generally took 10 to 12 seconds to kind of the workflow that we had mapped out. This tool allows you to click and add objects to your project with a click of a button. So you can imagine if you're building up an entire project, how much time that can save. The next function I'm going to show you is the NBS new specification button. So a designer can click the new NBS create specification. The tool will run through the BIM object, pulling out all the NBS references and descriptions. This will then pull that information out and start and talk to our NBS Create software platform. It builds up a report and pushes it into Create. If for all of you that already have NBS Plus, the BIM objects and the NBS Plus listing then talk to each other. And when we open the NBS Create software, you can actually click on the create sections and actually see your product specified. So it's starting to get products specified on the fly from BIM objects into your specification if you actually have NBS Plus and National BIM Library content with us. One final thing I thought I would show you is the NBS BIM toolkit. So when designers have finished their project and have a finished specification, they can load them both into the toolkit and compare them. So an end user can click on any part of, I think the video stopped, if they can click on a part of the specification, it'll light up and it'll be able to tell you the volume that it's using, how many instances the product is in the project, and you can start and build quite an intelligent report on what you need to do and streamline processes from that. And now I shall pass it across to Lee.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jane. I will now pass you over to Lee Jones from Ideal Standard.
Good afternoon, everybody. Trust you can all hear me okay. I'm going to talk to you about BIM from a manufacturer's perspective. Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right, so as introduced just, I'm Lee Jones. I'm the BIM manager at Ideal Standard. I've been in the AEC sector for about 20 years, and I've been responsible for BIM for our company since 2013. Ideal Standard are arguably the largest sanitary ware manufacturer in the world, so we make toilets and sinks and baths and all that kind of thing. We own the Armitage Shanks brand, as well as Ideal Standard and Satini in the UK, and we're roughly around a $750 million turnover business, so that's a hell of a lot of toilets. Just to give you a bit of background as to why it's appropriate for me to be speaking to you this afternoon. As mentioned, we actually started the BIM journey back in 2013, so that gives us sort of 5 years experience. which for such an emerging technology is quite a long period of time in the sort of whole picture. So we started in 2013, but in the first sort of 6 months of that, it was mainly research that we were doing. It was quite intensive, trying to understand what BIM was to start with, because back then industry knowledge was quite few. We didn't begin our full BIM journey until around 2014, when we started creating this Revit content that the guys from the NBS have just been talking to you about. We actually decided to do this ourselves. The reason for that was we had around 20,000 products that we needed to replicate digitally. So to create digital twins for all of those, it was more viable for our business to actually take this in-house, which it then became a full-time position, and is now a full-time position. So there's a team of us dedicated in the business to do that. Over the years, we've seen some fantastic achievements through BIM. We're now seen as an industry leader in the manufacturing sector for this. We've been awarded sole supplier agreements from tier 1 contractors, and gained a lot of business where we previously may not have been considered or would have been visible to people through BIM. So what I want to cover through this presentation is how BIM affects the manufacturer, what lessons we learned. I think that's going to be quite helpful. How to get the correct content, choosing the right platform to host this content on, and the right platform to actually create it in, and then obviously for anybody that's in the manufacturing industry, the return of investment piece, which comes from the sales leads. So how does BIM affect the manufacturer? Well, back in the 70s and 80s, a lot of us used to supply one of these to all the architects and designers. What the stencil did was allowed the architect to actually specify our content directly into their drawings. And then in the 90s, that stencil changed to these, the DWGs or CAD blocks, however you want to call them, as AutoCAD sort of swept across the world, moving the sort of the paper drawing and drafting to a digital process. The CAD blocks became the basic digital equivalent from those. On top of the geometrical things and obviously the detailing, the specification piece, now James just touched on that quite clearly. We have to provide classification information, product declarations of performance, a whole host of different data surrounding our products for the specification phase, but also for the in-use phase. So O&M data can take up quite a lot of detail for your product. And generally, to put it in a simple term, that's what a BIM file is. It's a combination of all of those things. So it starts with a 3D model. It's a little bit more elaborate from the CAD block. It has material finishes in. You can spin it around and do renders with it, and all the sort of the high visual side of 3D CAD. But as well as that, these models are actually intelligent. So that specification data and that O&M data is actually embedded into the file. So whereas previously with CAD, the series of lines that would have been on a drawing, it would have taken the human brain to actually interpret that as it's a toilet pan or it's a house. Whereas the BIM models actually know what they are. The one that you can see on the screen is a toilet pan. This model will know it's a plumbing fixture. It will schedule accurately, and it also has things like flow rates and connectors, etc. And that kind of information is replicable for all of the different products in the sector. So what lessons did we learn? Well, the first thing is you can't make everybody happy. No matter how much you try, there will be personal preference with all of your clients. They will have their own individual ways of doing things. But what you need to do is try and get that best fit, the sort of the scenario and solution that fits all. And that can come in the data or the geometry. Some people might want more geometry. They might want to be doing high-end visualizations, renders, even virtual reality with these objects. Some people might want it just for spatial planning. And then comes the data. People might want less data in the concept stage, but if they're in the technical design stage, around stage 4, or even at the handover when it's coming to facilities management sort of area, data is very, very critical. So it's finding that right balance. So obviously, to get all this nailed, standards have to be implemented. I mean, I've shown some phone chargers here, which might seem a little bit obscure, but if you think back 10 years ago, the amount of mobile devices that were around all came with an individual charger, which wasn't very effective. It wasn't great for the environment to start with, so a new solution had to be found. Maybe that's what we have with BIM today. There's been a lot of different formats, different standards, a way of doing it. In the UK, Revit seems to become the most popular platform, and it seems to be standardising the way BIM's created. Some stumbling blocks. Going back onto the pleasing everybody scenario, too much detail could result in bloated files. Chris mentioned earlier about not having too much of a large file size because the computational power can slow the project down. That will obviously alleviate as time moves on, but for now it's quite important. Deciding how you want your files to host. I mentioned earlier that these objects are actually intelligent, so the toilet pan that I showed you would know it needs to snap to a floor because it was a floor mounted pan. You might want things to snap to a wall, or you could need generic objects if they are able to be positioned in different places. And then also getting the correct material finishes in. You can go completely to town with the rendering ability on these things, but again, you're adding more data, so it's trying to find that correct balance. And then there's levels of detail. So throughout each stage of the project, people want different amounts of information, whether that's graphical or non-graphical. There are level of detail standards to interpret this, but again, it's a whole set of information that you need to interpret. Which brings me nicely onto the I in BIM. So BIM, building information modeling, the information is the key part there. It's very easy to get sidetracked by the geometry because the high visuals is quite appealing and it satisfies the brain from a sort of a pleasing point of view. But the information is really where BIM comes into its own. Now at the concept stage, that might not be too important. At the technical design stage, it becomes more relevant. So when we mentioned about the COBE data earlier, or achieving BIM level 2, what COBE does is it provides all of the manufacturer's information. So that includes things such as your warranty, barcodes, all that kind of thing, the kind of information that you will need to install and specify this product at the first stage, but to actually allow that information to pass through into the asset management phase. So a facilities manager, or even in a residential piece now where you're handed the pack digitally for a new home, that information is quite critical, and having that in one place is very, very important. Which leads nicely onto a common data language. So going into that data, and you would have seen on the screen just when Jane was showing you through the different COBE information, there's roughly over 100 lines of data that could possibly be put into each object. Now, if a typical residential house has around 3,000 components, that's 300,000 lines of data that somebody's got to tie in. That's where the BIM manager role tends to come in projects these days. So if we can name all these parameters in a structured way and have this universal language, it makes that job a hell of a lot easier and keeps that information much more tidy. So for us, just to quote exactly on the slide there, getting the data, it was straightforward enough to get it correct. But because of the vastness of it and the different standards and regional legislations that come into these things, it's where we spend most of our time with creating the BIM objects. BIM objects can vary in quality. There's good BIM. There's a whole lot of good BIM out there. I mean, you might trust a party such as the NBS to actually create the objects for you, so you know this is going to be checked against standards and it's going to be correct. You could have a go at it and get it wrong. You could even trust somebody that you know, or a reseller that might be doing this a little bit cheaper to do it. But again, is it going to be compliant? You might even decide to do this yourself, but then obviously you've got to go through all these stages where we were previously to actually get to this level. And then the standardizations. So with anything contractual, obviously norms come into place. The PAS 1192 series and the BS 8541 stipulate most of the standards surrounding BIM content and how this needs to perform in the whole construction arena. It can be a bit of a minefield. There's a lot of things to go through. But there's a lot of help about. I'm going to talk to you about where to look next. So the light at the end of the tunnel for us was the National BIM Library. particularly when they introduced the BIM object standard. Now, we're going back probably 3 or 4 years ago here to the first edition. We'd actually been creating content for around 12 months before this, but our data wasn't standardized enough. We thought we'd got it completely right, but it turned out it wasn't, which resulted in quite a bit of rework for us. The BIM object standard guides you through that step by step. It can be quite intense. As Chris mentioned earlier, it's a little bit heavy for bedtime reading, but it does actually guide you through that process. And in that, basically, somebody had gone through all of these standards and done all the hard work for us. They picked out the key elements, what we needed to comply to, and it just gave us that step-by-step guide to actually get the content correct. So all in all, if those steps are followed or the trusted partners picked, you're going to get this right quality of BIM content. None of us as manufacturers would want to send the physical product out that wasn't of a high quality. Reputation would very, very rapidly deplete, and obviously business would drop. And having a digital twin of that product, it's just as important. We are in the digital age now. This is a very, very big element, and something we take particularly seriously as a business. So to get this content right was important. We are now arguably the most downloaded brand on the internet. We get thousands upon thousands of downloads per month. And this is purely, I think, a lot of it comes through word of mouth. People know that the content they're going to get from us is going to be great. And then the next time we launch something, they're actually looking for this. And when we introduce new products or new objects, we do actually see spikes in the performance on those. So the return of investment. Obviously, we don't need BIM content to actually manufacture anything as our manufacturers. But what we do need is to achieve the sales. And that's what the BIM content helps us to do. So the main important thing for us and why we chose the National BIM Library was it's a one-stop shop for architects. As with anything, if you've got to start going to website upon website or calling people, looking in different places to try and get each component for your building project that you're designing, it's going to take up a lot of the time. Whereas if there's one dedicated library that you can trust and you know that that content's going to be correct and you're going to have all the different elements for the building there, the architects are going to keep using this, and the download statistics are proving this. Because it's the NBS, it was a trusted source for quality. It still remains to this day the high standard of content that I'm aware of. What it also did for us was it gave us exposure to potential new leads. So before we had this digital library of content, we were reliant on the salespeople going out and selling it, or people trusting the brand over the sort of 200 years that we've been operating. But what we had now was this whole sort of arena where there were new people that hadn't actually specified us before, and they were saying, well, actually, there's some sanitary ware here that we could use, and this would be the same for any project or product, and they were downloading that. But then the sort of the flashy piece for us, and this is where communicating the importance to our VPs initially with implementing BIM was sort of a big selling point, is the analytics. So as with anything, big data is a key thing. Most manufacturers now will have data analysts that are looking at sort of figures and stats and working out how we can improve our business moving forward and increase that business. Through the dashboard in the NBS National BIM Library, what we get is the list of who's downloading what, how many numbers we've downloaded, what countries they've been in, what products. This can allow improvements on things such as product forecasting, but ultimately it gives us that link back to the client, so you'll know which architectural practice, for example, has been downloading your content, and it allows you to sort of tailor what your sales force are doing surrounding those kinds of projects. It was a great solution for us, and one that we're happy to be continuing working with. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lee, for that. We do have a couple of questions already sent to us. There's quite a few towards you, Lee, actually. So I guess I'll start quite immediately with yourself. A question is, what would you do differently if you were to begin your BIM journey again? So I guess going back to the very start and everything you've learned so far now, what would you change going forward?
Right. what would you do differently? So I think that the first thing that comes to mind is obviously being in today's age and not being 5 years ago. We would definitely lean on somebody that knew more about this subject than us. That would likely be somebody such as yourselves, Chris, where we could actually go and gain this information from. We spent 6 months solid as a full-time role researching BIM, which is obviously quite cost-intensive, and it was time that I wasn't actually doing what was the day-to-day job at the time. So yeah, having that sort of expertise and the knowledge to actually learn from and sort of leapfrog would be what we'd probably do differently, I think, in the first instance.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I do have one for Chris Vickers here. We don't really get involved in public sector projects. Is BIM still relevant for me?
It's still relevant. I would say yes. I think if we look back prior to the mandate, I think a lot of the uptake will probably be from some sort of bigger practices. Once upon a time, sort of technology was expensive, but I think once the mandate's passed, so any sort of government work has to be delivered in BIM software. I think eventually we'll see that just BIM will become the norm. So I think eventually people will move away from traditional CAD. As I said, I think technology is now more accessible to the smaller sort of design practices. And I think people are just starting to realise now the sort of benefits and efficiencies that this sort of technology can bring. So I think the answer is yes, most definitely it will be relevant as we continue to see the sort of uptake and the technology. Obviously, the demand is only going to increase. So the focus won't be just on public sector specific sort of products. It will open up different avenues for other manufacturers to get involved with that as well.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Chris. One more, another one for you, Lee. BIM is mandatory for public funded projects. Do you find many commercial project architects downloading your files?
No, not at all. It's quite a good mix. So the way I can determine this, and probably the easiest way to explain it, would be our Armitage Shanks brand and Ideal Standard brand, and how they work independently. So the Armitage Shanks brand is very much a commercial product. It's what we put into your schools, prisons, hospitals, that kind of thing, all the public funded ones, which level 2 mandate would cover. Ideal Standard is very much a residential brand, so that tends to go into houses. Coincidentally, Ideal Standard is the most downloaded brand out of the two. There's not massive amounts in between it, but it shows that there's a good mix of residential architects and also the commercial ones downloading the same content. We are sort of tracking around sort of anywhere up to 10,000 projects at any one live time as well. We recently did some research and over 1,000 respondents came back, and we were finding that it was 60 to 70% of our client base. This was at the end of last year, so it's probably increased now. We're actually using BIM. So that's a hell of a lot of a large portion of that 50-50 split, so to speak, between the two.
Excellent. And Lee, before you mentioned that you had created 20,000 products as BIM files, we got somebody asking if you hosted all of these on the National BIM Library?
No. I think that would be a great thing to do, but obviously it would be very expensive. What we do is actually host the core product with you. So I think there's around 2,000 SKUs. Some of those objects are parametric, so there's more than one SKU in each object. But it's quite a high number of products that we've got with you, but it's generally the core stuff. So if we're selling thousands of a certain type of product per year, but only a handful of smaller ones, or we know that they aren't necessarily a specification type product, we wouldn't host those with the library. We just put the core products on there, which helps to sort of keep our business case and the cost spend that we're putting out quite neat.
Fantastic, excellent. Thank you, Lee. Just look at the time, we are reaching our 45-minute limit, so I think we will leave it there. Thank you very much for everyone joining us on the webinar, and thank you very much to Chris Vickers, Jim Hibbett and Lee Jones for speaking on the webinar. Those of you who are not a customer of the National BIM Library, please keep an eye out for a follow-up email this afternoon where we'll detail what the next steps are and what's services NBS can offer you. Everyone have a lovely afternoon, and thank you once again for joining the webinar this afternoon.
Thank you.